The year is 1991. At Kennywood, a small amusement park just outside Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a new steel coaster called Steel Phantom drops riders through a ravine and sets a world record nobody expected to see broken anytime soon: 80 miles per hour, the fastest a roller coaster had ever gone. In the 34 years since, with better steel, better computers, and launch systems Steel Phantom's engineers couldn't have imagined, we've only managed to go 155 miles per hour. You'd think building a faster coaster is just an engineering problem. Solve the physics, solve the ride. Except nobody has built a 200-mile-per-hour roller coaster, and the deeper you dig into why, the stranger the answer gets. Let's go through it properly. The first suspect is money. Surely nobody's built a 200-mile-per-hour coaster because it's too expensive. Except Falcon's Flight, the current fastest coaster in the world, was built as the centerpiece of a brand-new entertainment city outside Riyadh, backed by a government pouring billions into tourism as part of a plan to diversify its economy away from oil. Entire governments are already willing to bankroll record-breaking rides as tourism projects. Money is cleared. So if a government can write that check without blinking, what's actually stopping an engineer from cashing it? The second suspect is technology. Maybe the launch systems just aren't strong enough yet. Except Falcon's Flight already uses magnets built directly into the track to launch its train 3 separate times, pushing it past 150 miles per hour for the first time in coaster history, hard enough to press every rider back into their seat like a hand shoving them from behind. Technology is cleared too. The launch that could get you to 200 miles already exists, so the question becomes what happens to a person once they're actually going that fast? Which brings us to the suspect everyone expects to be guilty: the human body. In the 1950s, an Air Force officer named John Stapp rode a rocket sled to over 600 miles an hour and survived, temporarily blind and bleeding from burst blood vessels in his eyes, proving the human body can handle speeds far beyond anything a roller coaster would ever need to reach. 200 miles an hour, built properly, sits well inside what an ordinary rider can survive. The body isn't the obstacle here, and that's the twist. This isn't the 300-mile-per-hour version of this question, where the human body was enough to end the case on its own. Here, the body walks free, so somebody has to still explain why the ride doesn't exist. That leaves the track itself, and this is where the case finally gets complicated. Steel isn't the problem. It already survives far more violent forces in suspension bridges and skyscraper cables, holding tons of weight every day for decades. The real complication starts with wind. At 200 miles per hour, wind resistance is strong enough to distort a rider's face and turn a piece of grit into something that stings like a thrown pebble. The fix is simple on paper: enclose the rider in a capsule instead of an open-air seat. But that one fix drags 3 more problems in behind it. A sealed capsule needs a heavier frame and a completely different manufacturing process than the open-air coaster trains parks already build cheaply. The turns that felt like a fun jolt at 150 miles per hour become something closer to a punch to the ribs at 200, so every curve has to widen out, stretching the ride across far more land than a normal coaster footprint. And loading guests into a sealed, safety-screened ride takes longer than loading an open one, which means a normal coaster moving over 1,000 guests an hour could drop to a few hundred guests a day once all 3 of those fixes are stacked on top of each other.
None of these suspects on their own makes a 200-mile-per-hour coaster impossible. The money exists, the technology exists, the body can take it. Even wind has a known fix. But that fix sets off a chain reaction: heavier trains, wider turns, slower loading, that turns a normal amusement ride into something that costs more to build and serves far fewer guests than the roller coaster sitting right next to it. Picture the 2 rides side by side. One is a normal steel coaster, dispatching a full train every 90 seconds, moving more than 1,000 guests through the gates every single hour, all day, all season, in the same reliable rhythm that keeps a line of families and teenagers shuffling forward without much of a wait. The other is the 200-mile-per-hour version, a sealed capsule train, a security-style boarding line where every phone and water bottle gets checked before anyone sits down, and turns so wide the ride eats up several times the land of the coaster next to it. By the time the sun sets, the ordinary ride has moved thousands of people, and the record-breaking one has barely cleared a few hundred. Guests would wait in a line longer than the ride itself for a ticket that would need to cost far more just to make the ride worth building in the first place, and most of them would give up and go ride something else instead. A handful of concept designs for exactly this kind of ride have been pitched to parks over the years, enclosed capsule launch coasters sketched out on paper with the same wide turns and the same football field per second math as the ride described here. Every single one of those pitches has quietly died somewhere between the drawing board and the construction budget, not because any single suspect was guilty, but because the combined weight of all of them added up to a ride nobody could justify building. A park can spend the same tens of millions of dollars on 3 or 4 ordinary attractions that move guests all day long, or on one record-breaking coaster that spends most of the afternoon sitting empty between rides. Every time that math gets run, the record-breaking version loses, and the concept gets filed away, quietly, without ever making it into a press release or a groundbreaking ceremony. Which is why coaster speed records have crept up in tiny increments since 1991 instead of jumping straight to what the technology already allows. Steel Phantom held its 80 miles per hour record for only a few years before faster coasters started arriving through the 1990s and 2000s, each one adding a handful of miles per hour rather than doubling the number outright. Top Thrill Dragster opened at Cedar Point in 2003 and briefly held the record at 120 miles per hour, using the same kind of hydraulic launch system that would later power even faster rides. King Dakar took the record 2 years later at 128 miles per hour and held onto it for 5 years before Formula Rossa arrived in 2010 and pushed the number to 149. Formula Rossa then held the world speed record for over 15 years, a number that barely moved even as computers, materials, and launch systems kept improving behind the scenes. Falcon's flight finally broke that record in December of 2025 at 155 miles per hour, and even that jump only added 6 miles per hour to a number that had stood untouched for a decade and a half. Look at that whole history laid out, decade after decade, and the pattern is obvious. Every record adds a small, careful number, never a leap. That's not an industry that ran out of ideas about how to go faster. That's an industry that keeps running the numbers on every new speed jump and finding a slightly longer list of costs each time, and quietly deciding the jump to 200 isn't worth making yet.
So the next time you're standing in line for a roller coaster, remember this. The engineers solved the engineering years ago. Nobody's still up at night trying to figure out how to get a coaster to 200 miles per hour. The people building the next record breaker will lose sleep over something else entirely. Not whether the ride can survive the speed, but whether the line outside it can survive the weight. The fastest machine we could put on rails already exists on paper, fully designed, sitting in a folder somewhere waiting for a park willing to build a ride that most of its guests will never get the chance to stand in line for. Somewhere, a design team has already run these exact numbers on a real spreadsheet for a real park and watched the projected daily rider count come back too small to justify the projected construction cost. That meeting is the real reason 200 miles per hour doesn't exist yet, and it has nothing to do with speed at all.